I hope the test went well for everyone. I haven't seen any of the marks yet. The TAs are almost through marking the short answer. I tried to get the Scantron scan today, but I forgot to bring the forms with me, so I couldn't build the answer keys. So somehow I'll figure out how to get that done before Tuesday, so we'll be able to hand back at least the short answer section on Tuesday, when we'll go over every single question one by one and talk about the answers, okay? Any questions about that procedure? Yeah? Is it reading week next week? Well, okay, let's not do that then. Okay. So I guess the thing to do then is for me to post the marks and then hand them back as soon as you get back. Does that make sense? So I'll post them as soon as I can. I'm sorry, I could just, okay, clearly I'm not on top of my game right now. So yes, let's not meet on Tuesday of next week. Let's do something else. Was another question back there? No? Okay. Post which on Blackboard? The marks, yeah. So that's what I'll do. I'll post the marks on Blackboard as soon as I possibly can. And you can at least see what your total marks, so you see a total mark for the multiple choice, total mark for the short answer, and then, so if we get to Friday and maybe nobody has asked to write a makeup, I'll post the answers, and you can just look at the answers. And then we can briefly go over them on Tuesday, quickly go over them. Does that sound fair? So to be clear, everybody wrote the same test. The 3 forms were the same questions, just in different orders. So, yeah. All right. Any further questions about course mechanics or stuff like that? No? Okay, good. So today we're going to do clarifying meaning. So what we've done so far is really the core formal apparatus that you're going to need for the rest of the course. That argument mapping stuff is the kind of basic formalism that you need to know, you need to be proficient with it. So we'll continue to practice that kind of as we go along in more and more complicated ways. But really that was it. In terms of formal skills, that's really all we're going to do. It's not going to get any more technical than that in the sense of learning how to like manipulate syntax. Pretty much the rest of the course is going to be adding layers of complexity onto the basic argument mapping skills. So getting you closer and closer to being able to take a natural language argument and to translate it into that semi-formal structure and then analyze it on that basis. And that just means, really that just means bringing in more and more features of the overwhelming complexity of natural language. And we're going to start in on some of that stuff today to talk about clarifying the meaning of a sentence or a word. Yeah, okay. So, we'll start off with vagueness and ambiguity. So I'd like you to distinguish these 2 things that can make it unclear what a sentence is saying. So 2 different ways in which something can be unclear. If it's vague, it's that it has no clear interpretation, right? So that there isn't a very crisp or crisp enough interpretation of the sentence that you're looking at in order for you to evaluate what it's actually saying. Contrast that with ambiguity. Ambiguity is when there's more than one apparently clear meaning. So it could be one thing or another. It is ambiguous. Right? Those are 2 importantly different ways in which a sentence could be unclear. So taking vagueness first, in any context except for formal languages like math and logic, computer programming, there's very likely to be some non-zero amount of vagueness in any sentence. Like some aspect of it will be less than perfectly clear. But we should distinguish, so that doesn't mean that you should just accept that all sentences are maximally vague. There is, despite the fact that there's at least some vagueness everywhere except the formal languages, we should be able to distinguish degrees of vagueness, right? So that building is tall is pretty vague. That building is tall for a residential unit is less vague, right? You've given more detail and more context. That building is the tallest residential unit in this city might uniquely pick out one building, right? So it's still like not telling you exactly how tall the building is, but it's nonetheless uniquely picking out one object. So if your job is just to figure out which building is being referred to, this is sort of like clear enough to do that. And that building is exactly 50 stories tall, is the least vague of there, but like that's still Does that still contain some vagueness in it? That last sentence? How is that vague? Tell me one sense in which that might be a little bit vague. Like, how tall is a story? Right, so if the question is, how tall is this building, and I tell you 50 stories tall, you still haven't given me all of the information that I would need to determine exactly how tall the building is, right? So even in the maximally clear, so we went from like the most vague to the least vague, even at the least vague point, there's still like non-zero vagueness in that relatively clear sentence. So this is like just by way of warning that you'll never get rid of this unless you're doing, basically unless you're doing using a formal language, like an artificial language, like math or logic. Whether something is too vague, of course, depends on context, and you'll probably be sick of me telling you that things depend on context by the end of this course, but this is one of those things that does. So depending on your specific goals in a conversation, a given degree of vagueness might be totally fine, or it might be disastrous. So can you jump over that building? No, it's tall. That's plenty of information, like the building is tall, therefore I can't jump over it. For me to answer your question, that's more than enough for you to know, like that's a tall building, I cannot jump over it, right? So the maximally vague example that we used was specific enough in this context to presumably satisfy your line of questioning. Right? So degrees of vagueness, but also context dependent, whether the given degree of vagueness is too vague or not. This should all be fairly obvious, but I think it's worth like laying out in crystal clear terms. Similarly, so how are you going to mark the quiz? With great care. Well, now that's vagueness that you probably would care about, right? That's too vague for you to be satisfied that you know how I'm going to mark the quiz, right? So in that context, given what you care about, given your goals, given your interests, that's way too vague to be a satisfying answer. In other contexts, that might be fine. Okay, so vagueness. It's everywhere. But that doesn't mean that you can just let your language be vague, maximally vague, or that you don't have to care about the degree of vagueness in your language. The other kind was ambiguity. So a statement is ambiguous if it admits of more than one reasonable interpretation. And we'll talk in a bit about the principle of charity, but the principle of charity, which roughly says like, don't be a jerk in conversations, says you should choose the interpretation that makes the most sense wherever possible. Here's a couple. I didn't brush my teeth again today. How is that ambiguous? Yeah.
It could either mean that you didn't brush twice in a day, or like you didn't brush yesterday and now you're not brushing again.
Exactly. One is substantially worse for your breath than the other, right? Like not brushing twice in a day versus not brushing. Last night I shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got in my pajamas, I'll never know. Haha, I think that's Groucho Marx. Okay, I won't do violence against humor by explaining that one. All right, so I just mentioned the principle of charity, and I'd like to kind of get deeply into this because this is going to be fundamental for your argument analyses. This is a principle about how you should interpret other people's statements, and there's a couple versions here, right? So there's a principle of charity, adopt the most charitable interpretation of others' words among the possible interpretations suggested by the context. So that's from a critical reasoning textbook. Really just saying, in this sense, charitable means just like the one that makes them sound like they're making the most sense. And you really want to do that. You really do, even if you're talking to somebody that you don't like and you think they're wrong. Because, as I've been emphasizing, the point of an argument, the whole point of an argument, is to start from some point of agreement and then move inferentially to somewhere that you want the other person to be. So if you cannot establish that common ground, that space of agreement, your argument goes nowhere. You will not convince anybody of anything. The principle of charity says adopt a posture where you're trying to meet the other person conversationally somewhat halfway. This is absolutely essential. It's part of like being a good conversational partner, and it's also how you like make sense of other people's words. Donald Davidson has another version of this. It says the principle of rational accommodation. We make maximum sense of the words and thoughts of others when we interpret in a way that optimizes agreement. It's not exactly the same thing, but it really gets to the same point, right? You try to find an interpretation of other people's words where you're thinking that they believe as many things as you believe as possible. And again, this is about establishing common ground. Notice these are not logical principles. Right? These are not principles of grammar or the formal rules of reasoning. These are rules about how you as a human being should interact with other human beings who you may or may not disagree with. And the third version, Grice's principle of cooperation. A conversation is a cooperative activity, so try to work together at the topic to advance the topic at hand. And I'd like to go into Grice's version of this in some detail. He breaks this up into several principles. And going through these principles, I hope will give you some indication of why these are actually like not even optional if you're going to try to have a meaningful conversation with somebody. Yeah?
So for example, let's say I try to be generous, but let's say I get it wrong, and the other person clarifies the context,
Yeah.
and I still move it to him or her. Am I doing something wrong? Let's say a statement is ambiguous. I get
Right.
different meaning.
Right.
They clarify the meaning,
Mhm.
and I'm still using that as my argument. Like, so you're saying is wrong because you meant this or that.
Well, okay, so the question is like, if somebody has an ambiguous thing and you assume that the one makes more sense to you and you assume that it's that, but they clarify that it's the other, well, now they've changed. So if you ask them, like, which of these two meanings did you mean? Did you mean that you were in your pajamas when you shot the elephant, or the elephant was in your pajamas? And you're like, well, it must have been you in your pajamas. But they say, no, the elephant was in my pajamas. Well, now you have to accept what they said, right? You don't just stick with the one that made more sense to you. You don't just ignore what they're saying to you. That's not being cooperative in conversation, right? That's, if they tell you what they mean, and whenever there's a vagueness or an ambiguity, ideally the thing you want to do is ask the person, what do you mean? You ask clarificatory questions to like draw out what they're intending. So that's the best strategy. If you have the person right in front of you, asking them questions is better than the principle of charity. The principle of just like ask what they're talking about is like your go-to. The principle of charity is when you maybe don't have access to that or something like that. But so if somebody gives you a clarification, you accept the clarification and proceed on that basis, for sure. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. Okay, let's do Grice's Maxims. So this is a 20th century philosopher who is trying to clarify some of the extra logical features of what makes a conversation work. So he thinks these are principles that everybody kind of assumes anytime that they're acting in good faith in a back and forth with somebody else. And again, these are not logical principles. You will not learn about these principles in modern symbolic logic, because violating them is not, strictly speaking, like to act in a contradictory way, or maybe not in even an irrational way. It's just being uncooperative. But you'll see what happens when somebody acts uncooperatively. Like, really looking at these, the point of looking at these is to see how badly language would break down if everybody didn't at least try to follow these rules. It really wouldn't work at all. So, the maximum of quantity. Make your contribution as informative as is required, but not more informative. The maximum of quality. Do not say things that are false or for which you do not have any evidence. Maximum of relation. Say things that are relevant and only things that are relevant. And maximum of manner. Say things in a brief, orderly, and clear way. Simple, right? So, maximum of quantity. Say the right amount of stuff. So consider the following exchange. How's Terry doing in his work? Well, he shows up on time. Now, if you're asking how Terry's doing in his work, you're asking like, what's the quality of his work like? Is he fitting in? Is he doing well? Is he being productive? And if all you say is he's showing up on time, that strongly implies that that's all you have to say, right? Because you are expected by the maximum of quantity to give the relevant amount of information to answer the question that you've been asked. Now imagine if Terry is actually doing great at work. He's beating expectations, he's getting along with everybody, he's well-liked, he's up for promotion, and then you say this. It might even be true, right? So, Terry shows up on time every single day. He also does great work. You violated the maximum of quantity here because you've given less information than was relevant in the context, right? You said something true, you haven't made a logical error, you haven't even made a fallacy, really. Like, it's not even an error in reasoning broadly conceived. You just not cooperated in the conversation, and the implicature, right? So the implication of your words is something that is false, right? People will assume that you're operating according to the maximum of quantity and make an inference on that basis, which leads them to the wrong impression. Okay. Here's another one from maximum quantity. So where's the washroom? Well, the washroom is located in the northern hemisphere in this country of Canada, and more specifically in Ontario. It's in the city of Mississauga, in a building operated by UTM. It can be found on the second floor of that building. Okay, you're obviously just not helping. You're being extremely unhelpful by giving way more information than was necessary. And people will boggle. They will try to be like, why all this? Why not just like it's over there, right? So you can go either way in which you violate the maximum of quantity, giving too much information or not enough information. Again, nothing in there is false. Nothing in there is illogical in any strict sense. It's just violating the completely transparent assumptions that we all work upon that people are going to try to be helpful when we're talking. Okay. So maximum quality, I don't think I need to elaborate on this. This is just like, don't say stuff that you know is false. Don't lie to people. People will assume, generally speaking, that you're not going to lie to them. Yeah.
The first one about the video order, could that be considered a maximum quality because they're aware of information?
Well, they haven't said anything. So the maximum quantity is to say the right amount of information. The maximum quality is about the information that you do provide and to have it not contain falsehoods. So in the one about Terry shows up on time, they didn't say something false, assuming that Terry does show up on time. They said a true fact. So they didn't violate the maximum of quality. The maximum of quality says don't lie, don't give falsehoods. But they didn't do that in the Terry went to work. They just didn't give the amount of information that was expected of them. Okay. So don't lie. I mean, everybody assumes that you're at least trying to tell the truth. Yeah. It is a misrepresentation, but not via the maximum of quality, right? So it's not that you misrepresent it by saying something false, which is what violates this maxim. Good, good. Okay. Yeah? Certainly something can violate more than one of these maxims, so it's not the case that you have to categorize any error into one or the other of them, so there can be violations of both quality and quantity and that kind of thing. Okay, so don't lie. I mean, I guess this is not one that's sort of like always in operation because sometimes people are expecting you to lie. Like in some contexts, it's obvious that you're going to lie. But okay, the maxim of relation. This one is say things that are relevant. So A says, I'm out of petrol, I'm out of gasoline. And B says, there's a garage around the corner. Now imagine that the garage has been closed for 10 years, there hasn't been a drop of gas there the whole time, and B knows that. B knows that there's not going to be any gas. There's an empty, abandoned gas station around the corner, and B knows that. Given that this context sets up like, I'm out of petrol, and the implication is, can you help? What should I do? Please cooperate with me. B gives a completely true statement that there's a garage around the corner. It's just completely irrelevant to the question that was asked, and B knows that. This is probably an instance where you're also violating the maximum of quantity, right? So more information than that would have been helpful. Yeah?
Wouldn't you say it could be justified by saying that maybe there are no petrol stations around, so you could just store his car there?
There's more than one what?
You could just interpret it by saying that there is no petrol stations there, so you could store the car in the garage overnight.
I guess so. I guess so if the suggestion was you could store your car. But if it's an abandoned gas station, it's probably not the best place to store your car. You might be able to cook up a context in which this makes sense, but just given the I'm looking for gas, and then they tell you to go to a place where there's no gas, right? Would you find that helpful if somebody gave this to you? No, I don't think so. I think you would find this person was being uncooperative in conversation, right? They were not offering you, you asked for something and they were not offering you what you were expecting or hoping for. Okay. The maxim of manner. I hear you went to the opera last night. How was the lead singer? Well, the singer produced a series of sounds corresponding closely to the score of an aria from Rigoletto. Okay. Suppose that's true. Suppose furthermore that you liked it. You know, you thought it was great. What are they doing wrong here? What is B doing that's unhelpful? Yeah.
A's kind of like painted into the corner of like, okay.
Yeah, A's they're really not moving the conversation forward in any important sense. So what the maxim of manner says that they're doing wrong here is they're not being concise and clear. Right? So they've given you this complex sentence that conveys less information than maybe you would want it to convey. So if you just said, well, they did Rigoletto, you know, that's 3 words in that sentence. Like there's like 12 in that sentence. So you could have made this much briefer and clearer and more direct. This is maybe like possibly the least serious of this. So if somebody's violating the maxim of manner around you and they're talking in a way that's sort of more complex than they needed to, you still kind of get what they're saying maybe. It's not going to like completely collapse the conversation, but you're still not being maximally cooperative. Yeah? Academics probably should have this tattooed to their arm or something. Okay, so when maxims conflict. So there are often cases where you're put in a position where you can't satisfy all of the maxims completely. And then you have to pick which one you're going to violate. And you pick according to context, really. You just pick which of the maxims makes the most sense to violate in this context. So suppose B knows that A is planning a short trip to France. Say, where does C live? And B says, well, somewhere in the south of France. Now, suppose B doesn't actually know where C lives. All they know is they live somewhere in the south of France. A is trying to visit C. They ask, so where's C? I'm going to south of France. Where's C live? And they say, somewhere in the south of France. Now, clearly they have not given enough information for A's purposes, right? So they've in some sense violated the maxim of quantity. But if you genuinely don't know the answer, making something up would be to violate the maxim of quality. So just the fact that you don't know the answer means that you can't give the amount of information that they were hoping for. So now you have to pick one. You can either make something up, or you can give them less information than they were hoping for. In this context, I think it should be obvious that violating the maxim of quantity is better than violating the maxim of quality, where you're like, oh, they're in Montpellier. I don't know where they are. I'll just say that for the sake of having an answer, so I don't violate the maxim of quality or quantity. Okay. Right. So charity involves offering an interpretation that assumes that the other person is both cooperative and rational. Sometimes you can't do that, right? Sometimes the person you're talking to is not cooperative or not rational. It happens. In those cases, the most charitable interpretation is the one that seems to involve the least violation of these principles, right? So you just sort of have to holistically balance these principles and say, okay, you're not making sense. I'm going to try to figure out the way that makes the most sense of what you're saying, even if that's not complete sense or something like that. And again, when you're talking to somebody face to face, almost always the best strategy is to ask clarificatory questions. So this is just to say, like, the principle of charity does not say, maintain the belief that the other person is being reasonable and cooperative in the face of all evidence, right? If you have overwhelming evidence that this person is being unreasonable or uncooperative, then the principle of charity does not oblige you to like pretend you don't know that. But nonetheless, it's a good rule in general because really people try almost all the time to be cooperative in conversations. Like, except on the Reddit, like that's, in internet slap fights, people often violate these. And I think it's often just for pure sadism, just for pure, like to be annoying and to make somebody mad. But when you're talking to people face to face where there's the potential for them to actually hit you, then generally speaking, people try much harder to be cooperative. And if they like, if you're talking to somebody who has any kind of social relationship with you, and they're not a psychopath, you can generally count on people trying to follow these rules. And furthermore, you are better off, even if you are at least thinking that this person is not being cooperative, you are better off assuming that they are until proven otherwise. If you're going to have a productive argument or debate, because of course, debates only work when you have common ground. So, you know, of course, sometimes people are not offering you any common ground. Of course, sometimes people are just yanking your chain, in which case you cannot have a meaningful debate with them. Right? Debate is really a good times activity. It's an activity for people who are well-fed, physically safe, socially accepted, reasonably secure in all those ways. And really, those are the only conditions under which you can have a meaningful and interesting exchange of ideas. If somebody is literally your mortal enemy and they wish you dead, don't try to debate them. That's not the right strategy, right? Because you don't have any common ground, which is the necessary condition for for present an argument that could potentially convince anybody of anything. If they just think that the world would be better off without you and the end, you can't have a debate. There's nothing shared from which you can build premises to lead to your conclusion to convince them of anything. So I want to be absolutely clear here. I'm not recommending that you wander around like a naive fool, assuming that everybody's going to be nice to you, assuming that everybody's going to cooperate. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that these things are a necessary condition for the possibility of having a serious debate with anybody. And just mark that that's a very nice place to be. If you get into an exchange of ideas with somebody, a genuine exchange of ideas, it's like magic. Like magic is when you conjure objects from thin air. An actual exchange of ideas is like conjuring ideas from thin air. Like ideas come out of it that neither of you went in with. It's incredible. It's the best thing that you can do with words, in my opinion. But you have to be able to assume that the other person is cooperating to even be a potential to even enter into that space, right? And this is also why you should act cooperatively, because you can't force somebody into that space. You cannot berate them into cooperatively exchanging ideas with you. You cannot shame them into it. You cannot like scare them into it. It's really, really hard to get there. A brief confession, I am a recovering argument jerk. I spent most of my life running around doing exactly what I just said you shouldn't do, which is just to like try to use words as a club to beat people down and embarrass them. Because that's pretty much all I had going for me. I was really good with words and not much else. And I spent most of my undergrad doing this, right? Like I would go into undergrad classes and just try to like tear somebody apart. My goal was to make them cry. Like that's how I knew I'd won, if they started crying. And it gets you nowhere. I tried it for years and years. It gets you nowhere. People will stop talking to you. They don't like you. Really, really. You're not going to convince anybody of anything. You're not going to win friends or influence people. It's a losing strategy. I guarantee it. So, and I figured this out in grad school when instead of having a room of 30 people that you're probably never going to see again, you had a small cohort of people that you really, really need to have a continuous relationship with, right? And under those conditions, you can't just be a jerk and walk away. You have to have like a viable relationship for the thing to keep going. So in that context, I learned how to kind of like work on my argument jerky tendencies. And so I strongly recommend that you at least pursue the same project where finding common ground, trying not to make the other person feel like a jerk, trying to be charitable and cooperative. Really, it's incredible what happens. If you can get two people together or two or more people together who are in that zone, it's magic. Or you could be in an internet slap fight where nobody learns anything and everybody comes away mad. Those are, as far as I can see, the range of options. Okay. So, to get back to the sort of informal reasoning of it all, if you fail to follow the principle of charity, if you fail to follow any of these things, you end up in what's called a straw man fallacy. So we're going to do a bunch of fallacies throughout the year, just kind of sprinkle them in. Here's one of the most prominent ones, and it works in the following way. It's the error of attributing a different conclusion to the person that you're talking to than the one that they were trying to drive at. Well, weaker conclusion. Yeah?
Is it the same as saying clutching at straws?
Is it the same as clutching at straws? I don't think so. Clutching at straws implies you're making a desperate attempt to get something, whereas sort of like clutching at straws suggests that you're like, oh, come on, date me. Geez, I mean, I don't know, I got a good car or something. You know, that's clutching at straws, right? When you're like, you're not getting what you want and you're making desperate attempts to do so. The straw man is like like a scarecrow. It's like a pretend person full of straw. So the image here is that you set up a conclusion that's not the real person. You build yourself a fake straw man and then attack that, right? So it's much easier to attack the straw man, of course, than the real person that has the actual idea that is maybe complex and challenging. You just build yourself this nice, stupid conclusion and then attack that. And it's easy to attack stupid conclusions, of course. So it makes the conversation much easier for you, the attacker, but you're not following the principle of charity, right? This is one of the most basic violations of the principle of charity. So here's an example of this. So this was from my Twitter feed some time ago, but this is ContraPoints, who makes videos about various political issues. And in this case, the video was how to spot a fascist, how to spot somebody who's a fascist. And what she said was, oftentimes, fascists will say that they are not fascists, right? And then we see the following. Since my detractors claim to talk about logic so gosh darn much, let's talk about logic. In my last video, I claimed that fascists often claim to not be fascist. The best way to render this logically would be there is some x such that x is a fascist and x denies being a fascist. That is, there exists an x such as fx and dx, where f means f is a fascist and d means d denies being a fascist. Another vaguely plausible interpretation would be for every x, if x is a fascist, then x denies being a fascist. So those are two different conclusions that could have been the point of the video, right? But instead, my detractors are rendering it for every x, if x denies being a fascist, then x is a fascist. Well, that's completely idiotic way to interpret what I said. You have the conditional backwards, right? So if your claim is everybody who denies being a fascist is a fascist, all you need is one non-fascist to say that they're not a fascist to show that's false, of course. I don't think I'm a fascist, and I don't think that makes me a fascist to say that. But nonetheless, it could be true that for all people who are fascists, they say that they're not, or for many of them anyway. Okay, so this is a Twitter version of the straw man fallacy where somebody offers a reasonable, plausible, or at least somewhat defensible conclusion, and then the detractors offer a mangled version of it that is much, much easier to defeat. Right? Doesn't make the first conclusion true, but what it does do is clarify what the point of the conversation was and keeps people from, so this move here that's being made, this is one of the reasons why symbolic logic is helpful, because you can really explicitly say what you're trying to argue. All right. Okay, so just a couple other things, and then I'm going to hand out, we got some exercises today. Not much, but we talked about these before, right? Generics. This is just a sense in which, okay, so that was it for principle of charity. We've done principle of charity, we've done Grice's Maxims. Those were the interpersonal, kind of like social dimension of how to have a productive conversation. Now we're back into kind of more logical stuff. So interpreting exactly what a sentence means, and part of the point here is general in the sense that often sentences do not wear their logical structure on their sleeve, right? They don't have the logical structure of the sentence is not marked explicitly, and you have to figure it out from context or ask for clarification in order to know what's actually being intended. Now, generics is a nice example of that, and this is one of the ones that gets people into trouble so often. So often, pointless, confused debates circle around generics because there's at least 3 ways of reading a given generic. So the generic is birds fly, or dogs bark, or water is wet. Right? Those are all generic sentences in the sense that they're general. They talk about a class of things and attribute a property to that class. But here's 3 quite distinct readings that you could make of that generic. All birds fly, generally birds fly, or some birds fly. And all 3 of those, absent any context or further clarification, are potential readings of that first sentence, birds fly. Right? Now, here are 3 arguments based on those 3 different readings, and you can see what a difference it makes to what you can do inferentially with one of these things, which one you actually mean. All birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. That is a deductively valid argument that happens to have one false premise. It's good old-fashioned modus ponens. It's just that it's perfectly valid. It's just that one premise is false. Now, generally birds fly, penguins are birds, therefore penguins fly. Is that valid or invalid? Say again? It's invalid. That's invalid. Generally birds fly is true, right? Generally speaking, birds fly. Everyone agrees to that, yeah? Any worries about that? It's true. Penguins are birds, yeah? Right? Now, can penguins fly? Not unless you fling them, right? Not on their own steam they can't fly. So 2 true premises and a false conclusion, what does that mean it is? It's invalid. It has to be invalid. If the premises are true and the conclusion is false, it has to be invalid, right? Now, it could be an inductively valid argument. So suppose you didn't know anything about penguins. So blark. Generally, birds fly. Blark are birds. Therefore, probably blark fly. It's inductively valid. Certainly, the conclusion is by no means guaranteed. How about this one? There exist flying birds. Penguins are birds. Therefore, penguins fly. That's just a garbage argument, isn't it? It's a terrible argument, right? So, but all of those correspond to birds fly, right? All of them start from birds fly. So getting clear on what exactly the right reading of your generic is makes a determinative difference to whether you're making a sound argument, a valid argument, or an invalid argument. Okay. So to put a little more technical language on this, philosophers call the first thing a universal claim. So for any object in the universe, if that object is a bird, then that object flies. It's exceptionless. It's an exceptionless generalization, right? If you say all birds fly, what you're saying is there are no birds who can't fly. It's a very strong claim. It's an extremely strong claim. It's hard to find these kinds of claims outside of math and logic that are reliable. Generally birds fly is saying something about most birds or many birds or something like that. It's not super duper clear exactly how many birds have to fly in order for that to be true, right? But it means like of the set of all birds, there's quite a few of them that fly. There's the existential claim. that there exists some things like this, only claims that there exists at least one bird that flies. Right? So it's not the case that there are 0 flying birds. Yeah? So those are just the philosophical, logical names for those 3 different readings. And as you saw in the test, I like to ask you questions about the concepts that I'm introducing because it makes easy multiple choice questions. So, or easy for me to write anyway. I don't know about whether they're easier for you to answer. Right. Okay, so there's that. There's all that. The first part of the class was basically on how to clarify sentences. Now we're going to talk about how to clarify the content of concepts, so the words and ideas that make up sentences. And basically, I'm going to argue to you that this is less easy than it looks. That's more or less the conclusion of 20th century philosophy, is that defining things is really hard, and that you're probably not going to finish the job. So a definition of a word or concept is supposed to give you a method for determining if any given object falls under the word or concept. So if I say triangle, and I give you a definition of triangle, it should give you a method for taking any object and saying, does this fall under the category or doesn't it? An ideal definition would give you a crisp method, like a method that tells you what's necessary to fall into the concept and what's sufficient to fall into the concept. These are the ideas of necessary and sufficient conditions. So a necessary condition says, without this, anything that doesn't have this is not a member of the category. Notice that that is not identical to sufficient conditions, which tell you if a thing has this, then it is a member of the category. Right? So a necessary condition for being a human being is to be made out of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and nitrogen. But that's not a sufficient condition for being a human being, is it? Not every pile of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen counts as a human. But anything that doesn't contain those elements is definitely not a human. So necessary but not sufficient. You can have things that are sufficient but maybe not necessary. So a really nice definition, the ideal definition, gives you the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under a category. Sounds easy, right? Plato famously went around, like at the origins of the Western tradition of philosophy, Plato went around trying to find the real definitions of words like virtue and justice and knowledge, courage. He believed that those concepts corresponded with objective, mind-independent features of reality, right? So that the necessary and sufficient conditions for these things would actually be built into the structure of reality, and that you could access them through rational reflection. His mentor Socrates thought you could access these things by like bothering people in the marketplace hard enough. If you just asked them a series of annoying enough questions, you would eventually arrive at the nature of justice. So this is a belief, so his picture of how definitions should work is informed by his metaphysical picture of like the structure of reality, where ideas are more real than things or people, and that our material world is just a pale reflection of the world of ideas. This is Platonic idealism. So for him, getting to the nature of the nature of these ideas is really getting to the nature of the structure of reality, and that because reality must have a definite structure, these ideas must also have a definite structure. There must be necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be knowledge or virtue or justice or whatever. So I don't know how you feel about the world of Platonic forms. Most people don't buy that, really. Like most people don't agree that our world has this kind of like rational structure to it, in the sense that the concepts that we use in our day-to-day lives reflect real kind of fundamental features of reality. The 20th century was a century where philosophy questioned all this. Probably the leading figure in this is Ludwig Wittgenstein, or one of the leading figures in this, who suggested that most of our ordinary concepts just don't have strict necessary and sufficient conditions. You might want that, but they're just not, you're just going to be frustrated. That's to say most concepts. That's not to say that no concepts have clear, necessary, and sufficient conditions. Math, logic, and any other formal language, you can really give such a definition. You can give perfect definitions in those fields, right? So you can give a perfect definition of a triangle or a square. Square is a four-sided figure, four-sided closed figure with four right angles. Like, that's it, I think. Have I left anything out? Who remembers their grade 3 geometry? Yeah. And all of the sides are equal. Thank you. Yes, there's right angles, all the sides are equal. That was a rectangle that I defined right there. Yeah, so, and the sides are of equal length. Now, that's a beautiful definition of a square. That's exactly what you want out of a definition, because if anything satisfies that, it's a square. And if anything doesn't satisfy that, it's not a square. But that's the exception Wittgenstein wants to argue, right? That's not the condition. So that beautiful result, philosophers for a really long time hoped that you could get things like moral goodness or virtue or justice to fit that mold. And Wittgenstein argues that that's really just not going to be the case for almost everything that we talk about in our ordinary natural language. So this is a distinction I keep making over and over for you between artificial formal languages and natural language. Artificial languages look really, really different than natural language that I'm currently speaking to you right now. And in natural languages, in anything but this weird formal context, what you tend to get are not necessary and sufficient conditions. What you tend to get are family resemblances. So here's my family. That's me and my wife and my brother and my nephew and my brother-in-law and my niece and my sister. And all of these members share some features. We all resemble each other in some ways, right? But it need not be the case in a family resemblance that every member shares any feature. So my ears look like my sister's, but not like my brother's. My nose looks like my brother's, but not like my sister's. Right? So there's no one feature necessarily that all of us share. We do share, like we're all made of carbon, but like we have 99% identical DNA and all that stuff. So it's not that we share no features, but in terms of like what we look like as a family, it doesn't need to be the case in a family resemblance that any member or that all members share any one feature. The metaphor is more like it's a rope woven together from many fibers, right? There's no fiber that runs the length of the whole rope, but nonetheless the rope holds together because there's a bunch of similarities. So this is Wittgenstein's picture of how really most of our concepts are going to work. His prime example is probably games. So like, it's really difficult to give necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a game. Like, what do all games have in common that nonetheless, that furthermore picks out only games? You take a shot at it? Yeah. You're competing with something. So that could be the case. So in game theory, we talk about zero-player games with no players. So there's nobody to compete. So the game of life, if you ever heard of this, Conway's game of life, is like, it's a cellular automata program. It just sort of like acts out a program. There's no players, but it's nonetheless considered a game. And you might want to say, well, that's not what I mean by game. And that's fair, because it's not a prototypical game, right? It's not the standard game that you think of. It's not a central case. But nonetheless, people use the word game in that way. Yeah?
Game theory also suggests that there are two types of games, infinite games and finite games.
Okay.
Now, to compare both of them, we shouldn't have, because in game theory, both of them are considered different.
Oh, right. So I think that's just proving, so what he says is, in game theory, there are infinite and finite games, and the two are just radically different. I think that's true. But what that shows is that there's nothing universal about games. Like, we have this concept, and if you speak English, you know what I mean when I say game, but nonetheless, there's not any necessary unity in all the things that fall under the concept, right? There can be just this string of family resemblances. And again, that's a feature of ordinary natural language. It's not a feature of, like if you're using a computer programming language, the functions have really crisp definitions, don't they? There's no ambiguity about what a loop function does. It does an exceptionally crisp and clear thing, because that's a language that we made up and then told a computer how to read, right? So if you put anything into a computer, that means you formalized it, so you've gotten all the ambiguity out of it, at least if you can program it into a computer. So In languages that we make up, we can create conditions under which there's not family resemblances, in which there are necessary and sufficient conditions. But the kind of insight of, this is my favorite insight from like the second half of 20th century philosophy, is that that's the exception. It's a weird condition that we impose on language, not the rule. That's not how we operate almost all the time. Okay. Which, so on these one half of this exercise sheet, it says, are these definitions too broad, too narrow, both, or circular? How could these definitions be improved? What I'm telling you right now is that Wittgenstein would tell you that this is not a good question to ask, right? That there is no definite answer to these questions. That you should be at least slightly frustrated with me for asking you to answer these questions, because what I'm asking you for are assume that there's a crisp definition of these and tell me how it is violated by these attempts at defining it. So these are bad questions, but nonetheless, I think it's useful for you to like try it, because it's not the case that language is just this mush, right? It's not the case that people just use words however they want. We do have definitions of words. You can define words. They can have like relatively constrained meanings. Here are 3 different kinds of definitions, and they operate very differently, and I'd like you to keep them separate in your mind, because if you confuse them, you'll get confused. Okay, so there's essentialist definitions, there's stipulative definitions, and there are reportive definitions. So let's go through these one by one. So in an essentialist definition, the meaning of the term is set by something objective, right? So that's what Plato thought everything was like. Plato thought all definitions are essentialist definitions, and that it's really not a matter of us negotiating how we're going to use words. It's a matter of drilling down to the nature of reality and figuring out what these words really mean. Now, I just told you that Wittgenstein really threw cold water on that project, that it doesn't look like most of our concepts are like that, but you might be able to recover some, right? So for example, water is H2O. Like, that gives you, if you believe that water is H2O, that gives you a reliable procedure for taking any object in the universe and saying, is this water? You say, well, if it's H2O, yes. If it's not, then no. And that's not something that we stipulated, right? So we identified and referred to water for probably as long as we've had language, and yet we only figured this out in the last couple hundred years. How long has it been? 150 years or something? Lavoisier was in the 1800s, so it must have been after that. So yeah, maximum 150 years. And this, before that, how did you pick out water? Well, if it was kind of wet, if it was in a river, you know. We had sort of less reliable techniques for picking out all and only those things that are water. But when we figured out that it's H2O, suddenly we've got a method that's like better than any linguistic stipulation that we could have used, right? So this gives you the necessary and sufficient conditions, and it looks furthermore like they were discovered rather than just stipulated. Like you stipulate how a computer programming language is going to work. You discover that water is H2O. So if there are natural kinds in the world, like water is a natural kind, or if you say, you know, the electron is defined as the particle that has such and such weight and this charge, well, the weight is part of the definition, but it's discovered. It's not stipulated. We're still working on getting an exact measurement of the weight of the electron. So part of the definition of the electron is something that's supplied to us by nature, not by our linguistic practices. Now we can debate about how many actual essentialist definitions there are. Some people think there are no such things as natural kinds, and that they're just handy fictions or something like that. There's a whole debate about this, but there are probably fewer essentialist definitions around than Plato thought, maybe not none. But these are the exception. So, yeah, okay, so we said all that. Let's look at another type, so stipulative definitions. You can define a word stipulatively when you do the following. You say, in this context, by this word, I will mean. It's extremely common in legal contexts where, like, life or death decisions are made on the basis of the meaning of words, And all that stuff I just told you about Wittgenstein suggests that the meaning of words is a slippery object. That's not a good situation to be in, right? People's lives hang in the balance. You need these words to have definite meanings. What do? In the legal context, what you do is say, all right, by house, what I mean are blah, 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 right? They stipulate a definition. I don't really care whether that's like a natural definition, whether that's a definition that has its foundations in the structure of reality. That's not the issue. And furthermore, they don't really care that much if that's how people use the word commonly, which is going to be that third type of definition, the reportive definition. And so if people use the word house slightly differently than in the legal definition, that's really not a problem for them, because what they really need, is a crisp, clear, definite definition in order to apply the law the same all over the place. So, for example, in this class, argument refers to a conclusion and at least one premise offered in support of it. It does not mean just a premise or a conclusion or a fight between two people, even though if you ask the average person what is an argument, they would probably tell you something like that. Right? So I stipulated for the purposes of this class what argument would mean. That was me giving you a stipulative definition. The nice thing about stipulative definitions is that you kind of can't be wrong about them. You can't be wrong about a stipulative definition. So if I say, in this discussion by eggplant, what I mean is what people usually call bananas, and then I say eggplants peeled and eaten raw are tasty, that's true, assuming that you think bananas are peeled and eaten raw are tasty. So that's a bizarre way of speaking. It's an annoying way of speaking, but it's not strictly speaking incorrect, because what you've done is give a stipulative definition. Say, in this context, by this word, I mean this. Right? It's very useful in, again, law, philosophy, in places where you're building a technical jargon that you want to separate from natural language. So those are stipulative definitions. Okay, here's the one that's tricky. Here's the one that Wittgenstein was warning us about, which is reportive definitions, where you say a definition which simply reports how people use a word or phrase. This is the type of definition you usually find in dictionaries. And just a note about how to conduct yourselves in arguments. Anytime I see somebody referring to the dictionary to resolve a controversial question about what a word means, I think that they're an amateur in argument. Because the people who write the dictionary are just jerks like you and me. They're just people. There's no magic dictionary fairy that tells them what the real meaning of words are, right? They have no privileged access point to what the true meaning of words are. And they don't spend 2 weeks sitting around 12 people sitting around a table debating what a smorgasbord means. It's usually just one person doing their best, right? So there's nothing that makes the fact that it's put in a dictionary means that it's absolutely correct and can't be disagreed with. So a smorgasbord is a buffet with many small dishes. But if you go to a Chinese restaurant and say, this is a smorgasbord, if there's a buffet there, that's maybe not quite right. It has a slightly different implication than that. So, but despite the fact that this is, if you say, well, but in the dictionary, this is what it says, well, you're just putting too much weight on what the dictionary says. Right? Okay. Just by way of aside, it's a clear indication. Two things are a clear indication to me that somebody's an amateur in argument. One, citing the dictionary, and two, using the name of a fallacy. That tells me that you just did a course on critical reasoning, and it's your first time out. Don't do that either. I'll repeat that. But okay, so I thought this was interesting. So this comes off of Reddit, and it's a survey on what people mean by various probabilistic terms. Right? So it's very hard to get people to cash out what they mean by a word, typically speaking. But probability is a nice one because you can quantify it, right? So if you ask somebody, what do you mean? What probability would you associate with highly likely or almost certainly? And here's the curves that you get from that. Right? A couple of interesting features here. One, that there's a very strong clustering, right? It's not the case that people are just sort of randomly distributed across the possibilities. So people are agreeing to a really large degree on what these words mean. it's also the case that people are not giving the exact same answer. So there is a distribution. And I think if we were able to quantify the meaning of words other than probabilistic terms, I think you would see something similar to this, where people agree on the meaning of these words to a very large extent, but by no means perfectly. And sometimes is more perfect than others. So if you look at almost certainly, it's real tight clustering near the 100%. If you look at about even or we doubt, there's a much wider spread. So words in the way people intend them can either be everyone agrees, or it can be that people have a variety of opinions. And then there's outliers here too, aren't there? So if you look at just the edges of we believe, some people thought that that means about 10% probability. You know, most people thought it was somewhere between 50 and 90, but there was a couple of outliers. And in the realm of reportive definitions, it's hard to say that those outliers are wrong. Because a reportive definition is just how people generally use the word. You kind of want to be near the peak of that curve, right? You kind of want to be around what other people are meaning by their words because that makes it easier to communicate with them. But it doesn't make you just right to be near the peak of the curve. Okay, so again, two features. One, that there's clustering. Two, that the clustering is imperfect. And I think that's a general feature of how people use words, that we mostly agree, but not exactly. Okay, so assessing reportive definitions, this is kind of the project on the handout. They can be too narrow, too broad, or both too broad and too narrow. At least three ways for a reportive definition to be not quite right. Too broad is what happens when a definition includes things that do not match the meaning of the term. So a chair is a piece of furniture meant for sitting on, includes things that are not chairs, don't they? So there are things that are meant for sitting on that aren't chairs. There are benches, there are ottomans, there are stools. And this definition includes all the chairs. All the chairs are things that are for sitting on, right? I don't know of any, well, I suppose there might even be chairs that aren't for sitting on. But generally speaking, chairs are for sitting on, but also lots of other things are for sitting on, and therefore this definition includes too many things, and in that sense is too broad. And here's what happens if you use a too broad definition. P1, a typewriter is a means of writing. P2, you all have means of writing, therefore you all have typewriters. Right? Clearly a bad argument because one of the premises includes a definition that's just too broad. Right. Just the opposite, too narrow. A definition is too narrow if it fails to include some of the ways that the word is used. So a school is an institution that aims at teaching children how to read and write. Why is that too narrow? Yeah? Exactly, exactly. So that's something that's not included. A school of art is not included in that definition because that's not their primary aim. Or like ballet school. Right? That's still a school. Or a martial arts school is a school, neither of which are aimed at teaching you how to read and write. So things that you would assume fall under the definition of school but are not included in the definition, therefore the definition is too narrow. And here's what happens if your definition is too narrow. A farm is a place where vegetables are grown. This farm only raises chickens, therefore chickens are a kind of vegetable. Okay. And of course you can have both. You can be both too broad and too narrow to fail to include things that should be included and to include things that should not be included. So hockey is a game played on ice in Canada. Well, there's other places in the world where they play hockey, I'm told. And furthermore, hockey's not the only game that you can play on ice in Canada. You can play curling. Curling is a game that you play on ice in Canada, which is not hockey. So it includes things that it shouldn't, it excludes things that it shouldn't. Like, I'm not going to ask you on a test, is this definition too broad or too narrow? Because of that thing I just told you about Wittgenstein. Because the answer is pretty much always going to be this. It's both too broad and too narrow. because concepts have fuzzy boundaries, definitions have crisp boundaries. So what I might ask you on a test is, this definition is too broad, explain why. Or this definition is too broad and too narrow, explain why, something like that. Yeah? Okay. So just real quick, too broad, too narrow, or both, and why? I guess why is the important part. So a Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada. Too broad, too narrow, both, why? Yeah.
It's too narrow
Okay.
because the Supreme Court is also the highest court in other countries.
Excellent, excellent. So it's definitely too narrow. Is it too broad in some way? I can't remember if I thought this was too broad in some way, but that's good. Yeah.
It could be too broad too because you don't know which Supreme Court.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So it includes Supreme. Well. Okay. So wait, which Supreme Court? Is there more than one Supreme Court in Canada?
Well, like since it just says Supreme Court, it could be a Supreme Court in another country.
I think that's too narrow. I think that's too narrow. So it's excluded ones in other countries, but not in Canada. I can't think of a way in which this is too broad, but there's probably one. Poetry is I mean, okay, so if you want to do this, maybe just do the ones on the, I don't think we need to go through this. Yeah? Ah, so a Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada, or you should say the Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada. Oh, logically speaking, that's okay, right? So it's okay to say a Supreme Court, a person named Corey Lewis is giving a lecture right now. Logically, that's fine. What it violates is one of the maxims of conversational implicature, right? So it says, why didn't you use the definite article? Why did you leave it open that there might be another one when you know that there isn't? So it's not a logical error, it's a sort of like violation of quantity or something. Okay. Is that, I mean, okay, do you want to go through these or do you want to, is this fairly, like, so if you want to do more, do the ones on the exercise sheet and I'll post the answers during what is apparently going to be reading week. Okay, so this is not going to be a big feature of the test or exam, so yeah.
It says also circular, what's in circular?
Ah, sorry, yes, so circular, thank you. Thank you. So a circular definition is another way in which definitions can fail. It could be too broad, too narrow, both, or it could be circular. So if I say, that's whenever you use a concept to define a concept. If I say, what is ethical? Oh, well, that's what's moral, or something like that. Like when you're just using a synonym, or even using the exact same word to define the word, and that just gives you no information that's useful. Okay? Just another way for a definition to be not good enough. Yeah. Okay? Cool. Okay, so given all that, we can talk about analytic and synthetic statements. And again, this is the shredded tatters of the version of this course that I taught in the summer, where I was following a textbook where they talked about definitions and the analytic and synthetic statements, and they just like, there's analytic and synthetic statements, here they are. But actually 20th century philosophy kind of made this distinction not as clear as it might seem. So I'm going to give you the not clear version, which I think is more accurate. Hopefully it'll be clear, it's just that I'm going to complicate this distinction a little. So the naive version of the analytic-synthetic distinction is like this. An analytic statement is one which is true just based on the meaning of the words in it or its grammar. So if you know that it's true, a sentence is true, just by knowing what the words in it mean, or just by knowing how it's grammatically structured, then it's analytic. A synthetic statement are all of the other ones. So a synthetic statement is one which is not true just in the terms based on the meaning of its terms. And I want to insist a synthetic statement can be false. Just because it's false doesn't make it not synthetic. Okay? So one test you can run to decide whether a statement is analytic or synthetic is the following. The negation of an analytic statement is a contradiction. So here's an analytic statement. It is raining or it is not raining. So that's just logically P or not P. And you don't need to know anything about the concept raining in order to know that that statement is true. Just the grammar tells you that that's true. Now, if you negate that whole thing, this says it is not the case that it's either raining or not raining. That's a contradiction. You know that sentence must be false. So if you can negate it, if say that sentence is false, that's the negated version of the sentence, and it turns out to be a contradiction, then the original sentence was analytic. The negation of a synthetic statement is another synthetic statement. So if I say it is raining outside right now, I negate that. I say it is not raining outside right now. I don't know if it's raining outside right now. I haven't looked out the window in a while. Either one of those could be true. Neither of one is guaranteed to be true or false just based on knowing the words and knowing how they've been put together. Okay? Okay. So here's a couple really classic analytic statements. A bachelor is an unmarried man. Water is H2O. Triangles have 3 sides. Do note that none of those makes, so the triangles have 3 sides would make a terrible definition, right? So an analytic statement does not define, doesn't do the same job as a definition. It just has to be true based on the meaning of the words. Now, these are not, so this example of it's either raining or it's not raining was one where it's analytic because of the grammar or the logical structure. These are examples that are supposed to be true based on the meaning of the terms. Okay, but what did I just finish telling you about the meaning of our ordinary concepts? They're not that fixed, yeah. They're not, in natural language, the content of a concept is typically unclear. It is typically at least a little bit vague. So this distinction that I'm making between analytic and synthetic statements should strike you as a little bit fishy. These are classic synthetics. Well, these are some synthetic statements. There are more mice than tigers in the world. Probably true. I don't even know if it's true. You don't need to know whether it's true to tell that it's analytic, because just if you negate that, it doesn't turn into a contradiction. The speed limit of the 401 is 100 kilometers, or it's raining outside right now. All synthetic statements. And again, a synthetic statement can be false. It doesn't make it not synthetic. So this guy, W. O. Quine, one of the most famous philosophers of the second half of the 20th century, argued that this analytic-synthetic distinction is simply not as clear as philosophers made it out to be. So, but only in the case of the content of concepts. So analyticity based on grammar is straightforward. You can use logic to tell whether something's analytic based on grammar. But analyticity based on the content of concepts is much harder to get precise about when you're dealing with natural language. I won't bore you with his argument. His argument for this comes in the 2 Dogmas of Empiricism paper. It's a great paper, but I won't go through it for you. I think what I said about Wittgenstein should be enough to convince you that this is, like if you bought that stuff that I said before, that should be enough to convince you that this analytic-synthetic distinction is not perfectly crisp, because the content of our concepts is not perfectly crisp, and what you're saying is something is analytic if it's based just on the content of the concept. Okay, so a bachelor is an unmarried man. This is the classic analytic statement. Okay, is a baby a bachelor? Is a pope a bachelor? He's not the bachelor, although that would make a great show. Is the pope a bachelor? Not kinda? I think the best answer to that is like, I don't know, kinda. Not really. It'd be weird to call a baby a bachelor. That's kind of gross and perverse, right? Yeah. Sorry? Sorry, I still can't hear you. Yes, you would assume a certain age, yeah. So maybe the baby's ruled out by that. So the baby is not a man, it's a baby. Okay, so maybe the baby's ruled out. How about the Pope? Yeah, I mean, so, and then you have to ask yourself, so if we're going to be serious about these definitions, if you're going to use these definitions to sort the world into things that fall into the category and things that don't, you have to figure out, like, when does a boy turn into a man? There are a number of movies on that theme, but I don't think they give you a really clear answer, right? So this is like the most common example of an analytic statement, a statement that's supposed to be true just based on the content of the concept, and it's not super duper clear that it's analytic, right? So all it takes is one example of something that violates it to show that it's not analytic. So if the Pope is not a bachelor, then it's not the case that a bachelor is an unmarried man makes a good definition, because it has not done the job of a definition, of an ideal definition, to sort the world into things that are in the category and things that aren't. So, I mean, okay, so all of that was just to kind of wreck the distinction that I wanted to offer you a little bit. Not completely though, right? Because you can still sort the world into, you can still somewhat sort things into analytic and synthetic statements. To the degree that you're confident about your definition, to the degree that you think you have a good definition, you can tell whether a statement is analytic or synthetic. So all ophthalmologists are doctors. Analytic or synthetic? And an ophthalmologist is an eye doctor. Analytic. Once you put it that way, it's obviously analytic, because if somebody's a kind of doctor, they must be a doctor. You can probably rephrase that in some way that makes it logically explicit, right? So like, all doctors who are eye doctors are doctors. Well, you don't even need to know what a doctor is to know that's true, right? All X's that are Y are X's is analytic in terms of its logical structure. Universities are good places to meet new friends. Synthetic, possibly false, depending on how it's going. People who run move their bodies. I think that's analytic. For reasonable definitions of those words, so like for the common-ish definitions of those words. If you're playing Skyrim and you're just sitting there and your character's running, and you say, I am running, because you're doing that, that's your activity that you're doing, then you're sitting still and running, so this is false. Yeah, you kind of just played with the word run there. Like, so what does it mean to run? Does it mean like to, what's that? I think you played with I. Oh, yes, yeah, so, yes, so the subject has been so people who run, you assume that is them running, not some avatar that it's not just them pressing W, right? Like, so. Okay, here's a trick question. This is explicitly a trick question. Is 4 plus 4 equals 8 analytic or synthetic?
I think analytic or synthetic would apply to statements that are not logically.
Yeah. I mean, okay, so it's a perfectly reasonable answer to say that this is analytic. I think that's what most, but to actually answer that question, you have to do some philosophy of math. You have to tell me, so like, is it contained in the concept of 4 and plus and equals that 4 plus 4 equals 8? Yeah?
Is it like it would be synthetic because you're saying that 4 plus 4 is a definition of 8, but 4 plus 4, is only one way to get you.
Right, good, yeah, so like, yeah, so it's, on that line of reasoning, that's not you haven't really like defined 8 or something like that, right? Like it's not part of the meaning of 8 that it is 4 plus 4. It's probably more obvious when you look at less obvious mathematical equations. So like I don't know. Okay. Anyway, so just the point here is that so Kant thought that math was synthetic. Right? He thought that you learned new things when you did math. And the alternative is just that all mathematical discovery is just cranking out the consequences of things you already believed. So you learn nothing. When you derive a new mathematical theorem as a math person, you've learned nothing except what you already knew, some consequence of what you already knew, whereas Kant thought you gain new knowledge as you learn new math. All right. Our sun is quite average in our galaxy. That's synthetic. You guys have got this well enough that I know that you get that. All right. Okay, so that was it for that. Feel free to hang around and do the exercises, but you're all free to go now. And I'm sorry I didn't realize it was reading week next week. So I will post the answers to the midterm or the first term test and your marks as soon as I can. Okay, thanks.